Chapter 3. Are Sada and Mazoch complementary? With Sada and Mazoch, the function of literature is not to describe the world, since this has already been done, but to define a counterpart of the world capable of containing its violence and excesses. It has been said that an excess of stimulation is in a sense erotic. Thus eroticism is able to act as a mirror to the world by reflecting its excesses, drawing out its violence and even conferring a spiritual quality on these phenomena by the very fact that it puts them at the service of the senses. Sada, in philosophy in the bedroom, distinguishes between two kinds of wickedness, the one dull wit and commonplace, the other purified, self-conscious and because it is sensualized, intelligent. Similarly, the words of this literature create a counter-language which has a direct impact on the senses. It is as though Sada were holding up a perverse mirror in which the whole course of nature and history were reflected, from the beginning of time to the revolution of 1789. In the isolation of their remote chateaus, Sada's heroes claim to reconstruct the world and rewrite the history of the heart. They muster the forces of nature and tradition, from everywhere, Africa, Asia, the ancient world, to arrive at their tangible reality and the pure sensual principle underlying them. Ironically, they even strive toward a republicanism of which the French are not yet capable. In Mazoch we find the same ambition, to hold up a perverse mirror to all nature and all mankind, from the origins of history to the 1848 revolutions of the Austrian Empire, the history of cruelty in love. For Mazoch, the minorities of the Austrian Empire are an inexhaustible source of stories and customs, hence the Galician, Hungarian, Polish, Jewish and Prussian tales that form the main part of his work. Under the general title The Heritage of Cain, Mazoch conceived of a universal work, the natural history of humanity in a cycle of stories with 6 main themes: love, property, money, the state, war, and death. Each of these forces was to be restored to its cruel physical immediacy, under the sign of Cain, in the mirror of Cain, he was to show how monarchs, generals, and diplomats deserved to be thrown in jail and executed along with murderers. Point 6 Mazoch liked to imagine that the Slavs were in need of a beautiful female despot, a terrible Tsarina, to ensure the triumph of the revolutions of 1848 and to strengthen the Pan-Slavic movement. A further effort, Slavs, if you would become republicans. To what extent can we regard Sada and Mazoch as accomplices or complementary forces? The sadomasochistic entity was not invented by Freud. We find it in the work of Krafft-Ebing, Havelock Ellis, and Fear. The strange relationship between pleasure in doing and pleasure in suffering evil has always been sensed by doctors and writers who have recorded man's intimate life. The meeting of sadism and masochism, the affinity that exists between them, is apparent in the work of both Sada and Mazoch. There is a certain masochism in Sada's characters. In the 120 Days of Sodom we are told of the tortures and humiliations which the libertines deliberately undergo. The sadist enjoys being whipped as much as he enjoys whipping others. Saint Font in Juliet arranges for a gang of men to assail him with whips. La Borghese cries, I would wish that my aberrations lead me like the lowest of creatures to the fate which befits their wantonness. For me the scaffold would be a throne of exquisite bliss. Conversely, there is a certain sadism in masochism. At the end of his ordeals, Severin, the hero of Venus in Furs, declares himself cured and turns to whipping and torturing women. He sees himself no longer as the anvil but as the hammer. However, it is remarkable that in both instances the reversal should only occur at the end of the enterprise. Severin's sadism is a culmination. It is as though expiation and the satisfaction of the need to expiate were at last to permit the hero what his punishments were previously intended to deny him. Once they have been undergone, punishments and suffering allow the exercise of the evil they once prohibited. Likewise, the masochism of the sadistic hero makes its appearance at the outcome of his sadistic exercises. It is their climax, the crowning sanction of their glorious infamy. The libertine is not afraid of being treated in the way he treats others. The pain he suffers is an ultimate pleasure, not because it satisfies a need to expiate or a feeling of guilt, but because it confirms him in his inalienable power and gives him a supreme certitude. Through insults and humiliations, in the throes of pain, the libertine is not expiating, but in Sada's words, he rejoices in his inner heart that he has gone far enough to deserve such treatment. This kind of paroxysm in Sada's heroes is highly significant, for it means, as Maurice Blancat points out, that in spite of the similarity of the descriptions, it seems fair to grant the paternity of masochism to Sacher Mazoch and that of sadism to Sada. Pleasure and humiliation never detracts from the mastery of Sada's heroes, debasement exalts them, emotions such as shame, remorse, or the desire for punishment are quite unknown to them. 7. It would therefore be difficult to say that sadism turns into masochism and vice versa. What we have in each case is a paradoxical byproduct, a kind of sadism being a humorous outcome of masochism, and a kind of masochism the ironic outcome of sadism. But it is very doubtful whether the masochist sadism is the same as Sada's, or the sadist masochism the same as Mazoch is. The masochist is able to change into a sadist by expiating, the sadist into a masochist on condition that he does not expiate. If its existence is too hastily taken for granted, the sadomasochistic entity is liable to become a crude syndrome that fails to satisfy the demands of genuine symptomatology. It rather falls into the category of disturbances mentioned earlier, which are coherent in appearance only and which must be broken down into discrete clinical entities. We should not deal with the problem of symptoms too lightly. It is sometimes necessary to start again from scratch and to break up a syndrome that blurs and arbitrarily unites radically dissimilar symptoms. Hence our suggestion that Mazoch was perhaps an even greater clinician than Sada, in that he provided various elucidations and intuitions which helped to break down the spurious sadomasochistic unity. The belief in this unity is to a large extent the result of misunderstandings and careless reasoning. It may seem obvious that the sadist and the masochist are destined to meet. The fact that the one enjoys inflicting while the other enjoys suffering pain seems to be such striking proof of their complementarity that it would be disappointing if the encounter did not take place. A popular joke tells of the meeting between the sadist and a masochist. The masochist says, "Hurt me." The sadist replies, "No." This is a particularly stupid joke, not only because it is unrealistic but because it foolishly claims competence to pass judgment on the world of perversions. It is unrealistic because a genuine sadist could never tolerate a masochistic victim. One of the monk's victims in Justine explains, they wish to be certain their crimes cost tears, they would send away any girl who was to come here voluntarily. Neither would the masochist tolerate a truly sadistic torturer. He does of course require a special nature in the woman torturer, but he needs to mold this nature, to educate and persuade it in accordance with his secret project, which could never be fulfilled with a sadistic woman. One, Sacher Mazoch should not have been surprised that Sacher Mazoch failed to respond to one of their sadistic woman friends. Conversely, the critics were wrong in suspecting Wanda of lying because she presented a vaguely innocent image of herself, however cunningly and clumsily. Sadistic characters do of course play a part in the masochistic situation as a whole, and the novels of Mazoch, as we shall see, offer many examples of this. But their role is never a direct one, and it becomes significant only in the context of the situation that exists before their appearance. The female torturer regards with suspicion the sadist who proposes to help her, as though she sensed the incompatibility of their respective aims. In The Fisher of Souls, the heroine Dragomira expresses this feeling to the cruel Count Bogislav Soltag, who believes she is sadistic and cruel. You make people suffer out of cruelty, but I castigate and kill in the name of God, without pity, but also without hatred. We tend to ignore this obvious difference. The woman torturer of masochism cannot be sadistic precisely because she is in the masochistic situation. She is an integral part of it, a realization of the masochistic fantasy. She belongs in the masochistic world, not in the sense that she has the same taste as her victim, but because her sadism is of a kind never found in the sadist. It is as it were the double or the reflection of masochism. The same is true of sadism. The victim cannot be masochistic, not merely because the libertine would be hurt if she were to experience pleasure, but because the victim of the sadist belongs entirely in the world of sadism and is an integral part of the sadistic situation. In some strange way she is the counterpart of the sadistic torturer. In Sada's two great novels which are like the reflections of each other, Juliet and Justine, the depraved and the virtuous girl, are sisters. Sadism and masochism are confused when they are treated like abstract entities each in isolation from its specific universe. Once they have been cut off from their own wealth and stripped of their flesh and blood, it seems natural that they should fit in with each other. This is not to say that the victim of the sadist is herself sadistic, nor that the torturer of masochism is masochistic. But equally unacceptable is Krafft-Ebing's view according to which the torturer of masoch is either a true sadist or else pretends to be one. In our opinion the woman torturer belongs entirely to masochism. Admittedly she is not a masochistic character, but she is a pure element of masochism. By distinguishing in a perversion between the subject, the person, and the element, the essence, we are able to understand how a person can elude his subjective destiny, but only with partial success, by playing the role of an element in the situation of his choice. The torturess escapes from her own masochism by assuming the active role in the masochistic situation. It is a mistake to think that she is sadistic or even pretending to be so. We must not imagine that it is a matter of the masochist encountering a sadist by a stroke of luck. Each subject in the perversion only needs an element of the same perversion and not a subject of the other perversion. Whenever the type of the woman torturer is observed in the masochistic setting, it becomes obvious that she is neither a genuine sadist nor a pseudo-sadist but something quite different. She does indeed belong essentially to masochism, but without realizing it as a subject, she incarnates instead the element of inflicting pain in an exclusively masochistic situation. Masoch and his heroes are constantly in search of a peculiar and extremely rare feminine nature. The subject in masochism needs a certain essence of masochism embodied in the nature of a woman who renounces her own subjective masochism. He definitely has no need of another subject, i.e., the sadistic subject. Admittedly the term sadomasochism does not merely imply the external event of two persons meeting. Nevertheless the theme of an encounter often persists, if only in the form of a witticism floating in the unconscious. When Freud took up and reformulated the question of sadomasochism, he started with the consideration that sadomasochism operates within one and the same individual, involving opposite instincts and drives. A person who feels pleasure in producing pain in someone else in a sexual relationship is also capable of enjoying as pleasure any pain which he may himself derive from sexual relations. A sadist is always at the same time a masochist, although the active or the passive aspect of the perversion may be the more strongly developed in him and may represent his predominant sexual activity. His second consideration is that there is an identity of experience. The sadist, qua sadist, is only able to feel pleasure in inflicting pain because he has experienced in the past the link between his own pleasure and the pain he has suffered. This argument is all the more curious in that it is stated in the light of Freud's first thesis, where sadism is made to precede masochism. But Freud distinguishes two types of sadism. The first is purely aggressive and only aims at domination, the second is hedonistic and aims at producing pain in others. The masochistic experience of a link between one's own pleasure and one's own pain falls between these two forms of sadism. It would never occur to the sadist to find pleasure in other people's pain if he had not himself first undergone the masochistic experience of a link between pain and pleasure. Point 9. Thus Freud's first model is more complex than it seems, and suggests the following sequence: aggressive sadism, turning around of sadism upon the self; masochistic experience, hedonistic sadism, by projection and regression. Note that the consideration of an identity of experience is invoked by Sada's libertines, who thus contribute to the idea of a sadomasochistic entity. Noirsuil explains that the libertine's experience of his own pain is related to a stimulation of his nervous fluid. It is therefore scarcely surprising that a man thus endowed should imagine that he moves the object of his pleasure by the same means that affect him. The third argument is concerned with transformations. It consists in showing that the sexual instincts are liable to merge into one another or to transform themselves directly with respect both to their aims and to their objects, reversal into the opposite, turning around upon the self. Again, this argument is curious since Freud's attitude toward theories of transformation is extremely reserved. On the one hand, he does not believe in an evolutionary tendency. On the other, the dualism which he always maintained in his theory of the instincts places a definite limitation on the possibility of transformations, since according to this theory they can never occur between one group of instincts and another. Thus, in the ego and the ID, Freud explicitly rejects the hypothesis of a direct transformation of love into hate and vice versa, owing to the fact that these agencies depend on qualitatively differentiated instincts, eros and thanatos. In fact, Freud shows a much greater affinity with Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire than with Darwin. When Freud says that we do not become perverse but simply fail to outgrow the perverse stage of infancy, he uses a formula which comes very close indeed to that used by Geoffroy in connection with freaks. The key concepts of fixation and regression are in direct line of descent from Geoffroy's teratology, arrested development and retrogradation. Geoffroy's point of view excludes all evolution by direct transformation. There is only a hierarchy of possible types and forms, and development within this hierarchy stops at a more or less early stage, or retrogradation sets in more or less severely. We find the same conception in Freud. The various combinations of the two types of instincts make up a whole hierarchy of forms at which the individual may become fixated or to which he may regress. It is all the more remarkable that in his treatment of perversions Freud seems to admit of a polymorphous system with possibilities of evolution and direct transformation, which he regards as unacceptable in the field of neurotic and cultural formations. Therefore, if we are to view the concept of a sadomasochistic entity in the light of Freud's arguments, we are faced with a problem. Even the notion of a component instinct is a dangerous one in this context since it tends to make us ignore the specificity of types of sexual behavior. We tend to forget that all the available energy of the subject becomes mobilized at the service of its particular perversion. The sadist and the masochist might well be enacting separate dramas, each complete in itself, with different sets of characters and no possibility of communication between them, either from inside or from outside. Only the normal communicate, more or less. In the sphere of perversions, it is a mistake to confuse the formations, the Concrete and specific manifestations, with an abstract grid, as though a common libidinal substance flowed now into one form, now into another. We are told that some individuals experience pleasure both in inflicting pain and in suffering it. We are told furthermore that the person who enjoys inflicting pain experiences in his innermost being the link that exists between the pleasure and the pain. But the question is whether these facts are not mere abstractions, whether the pleasure-pain link is being abstracted from the concrete formal conditions in which it arises. The pleasure-pain complex is regarded as a sort of neutral substance common to both sadism and masochism. The link is even further specified by being ascribed to a particular subject, and it is supposed to be experienced equally and identically by the sadistic and the masochistic subject, regardless of the concrete forms from which it results in each case. To assume that there is an underlying common substance which explains in advance all evolutions and transformations is surely to proceed by abstraction. Even though the sadist may definitely enjoy being hurt, it does not follow that he enjoys it in the same way as the masochist. Likewise, the masochist's pleasure in inflicting pain is not necessarily the same as the sadist's. We are inevitably led back to the problem of syndromes. Some syndromes merely attach a common label to irreducibly different disturbances. Biology warns us against over-hasty acceptance of the existence of an uninterrupted evolutionary chain. The fact that two organs are analogous need not mean that there is an evolutionary link between them. We should avoid falling into evolutionism by aligning in a single chain results which are approximately continuous but which imply irreducible and heterogeneous formations. An eye, for example, could be produced in several independent ways, as the outcome of different sequences, the analogous product of completely different mechanisms. I suggest that this is also true of sadism and masochism and of the pleasure-pain complex as their allegedly common organ. The concurrence of sadism and masochism is fundamentally one of analogy only. Their processes and their formations are entirely different. Their common organ, their eye, squints and should therefore make us suspicious.